It's good to be with all of you, and it's wonderful to be in this room and in this building with such a beautiful history of social change. I don't know if you know that it's actually the home of the suffragette movement, as well as now the home of the National Republican Women's Association. So that history of the suffragette movement is close to my heart and probably close to many of your hearts, and I'm really actually eager to find out more about it. I'm going to do my homework. But I'm here today to really share with you a little bit about my journey and hear about your journey at this extremely partisan time, because I think you've probably noticed, as I have, there's a pretty profound contrast now between the prayers that we've been saying today, the mantras we've been intoning. Thank you. The philosophy of anthroposophy. In my lifetime, the field of conflict resolution and mediation and emotional intelligence and social emotional learning and awareness of the world and the oneness and interdependence. In my lifetime, the first pictures of the Earth from outer space. In your lifetimes, an extraordinary rising of human consciousness, on the one hand. And on the other hand, what seems to be a precipitous decline in public discourse and a precipitous decline in democracy's ability to have a conversation with itself. The great philosopher and journalist Hannah Arendt said, democracy needs a place to sit down. And democracy seems to have lost that place to sit down. So how do each of you explain this contrast between the kind of wisdom that's emerged in the last half century, awareness of ecology, awareness of the interdependence of the world, awareness of the Earth as one living system, an awareness that all boundaries between countries have been drawn by man, but from outer space it's all one blue planet. An awareness, since Getting to Yes was published in 1982, of the power of human beings to work through conflict and find common ground. A growth in education and a deep, powerful growth in mindfulness and awareness of the spiritual dimension of life, on the one hand, and on the other hand, this decline in our public discourse. So that's the terrain that I'd like to talk about, because intellect and intuition and collaborative leadership, all the concepts that are floating here today in this seminar, I think are related to the answer. And I would like to dive into that in a series of steps. The first step is I'd like to just tell you my personal story for a few minutes. After I've told you my personal story, I'd like to share with you a conceptual framework that I've found useful for understanding what's going on. And then finally, I'd like to end with some action steps that I think ordinary citizens like you and me can take to make a difference. Those are the three steps that I'd like to do, and then a few closing comments. And I'm fascinated to be here in a tradition that was started with Alice Bailey, who talked a lot about overcoming separateness and realizing the oneness of all creation, because you'll see that that's implicit in some of my storytelling. But before I tell my personal story, let me tell you the four questions that I hope by the end of our time together in my session we'll have addressed. The first is, do nations have souls? It's in the title of this seminar. Do nations have souls, and if so, what is the relationship of a nation's soul to our own? And then our intuition and collaborative leadership about wholeness and oneness. If so, can partisan politicians struggling for power rise to power with this sensibility? In other words, what does this all have to do for someone who's trying to run for office in a partisan world, which is what's happening in the world around us, not only in America, but in the countries that I've worked in for the UN around the world. Every country I've worked in has competing partisan politicians. What is the dynamic tension between national citizenship and global citizenship, because we are going to be using those terms. And then finally, how can we harness conflict so that it meets Einstein's challenge that we can't solve problems on the same level of consciousness that created them? So how do we harness conflict so that it lifts consciousness rather than what we're seeing on our television screens most nights is that conflict is decreasing or depressing or undermining human consciousness. So that's where I'd like to go. And as I tell you my personal story, know that I'm doing so in the context of this larger inquiry that I think probably we're all wanting to share. I'm going to get off my little perch here for a moment. So I grew up in the 1950s. I grew up in the 1950s in a very conservative place at a very conservative time. There was nothing more conservative than Indianapolis, Indiana in the 1950s. In fact, I walked by the home of the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan on my way to elementary school. And I'm sure that if you had done a CAT scan of my brain when I was 12 or 14, you probably would have found a racist, homophobic, war-loving, patriotic, conservative. I graduated from high school, and I was the first from my high school to go to Harvard in the late 1960s. So suddenly I went from this very conservative place, arch-conservative place, to a place that was not only liberal but radical. And I very quickly became anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-war, anti-patriarchy, anti-whatever I had believed before. So I went from being in the colors of our I went from being red to blue, two primary colors, and I felt so strongly that I literally risked my freedom by turning in my draft card at the Pentagon to oppose the Vietnam War, and I emerged into adulthood convinced that there was this separation between liberals and conservatives, and that you had to be one or the other, and that if you were one, your destiny was to argue with the other. And so I began my 20s in lots of arguments, and I worked for a while at Yale in a liberal think tank project with a young up-and-coming lawyer named Hillary Rodham, who was dating a guy named Bill, and we put out a bunch of liberal proposals to President Richard Nixon and President Gerald Ford, and they ignored them because they were conservatives and we were liberals. And it was just one big war of words. And as I started watching this, having gone from thinking that loving my country meant being blue or red, to thinking that loving my country meant being blue, to thinking that loving my country meant arguing, I started feeling like the arguments felt more and more like my parents, who divorced when I was 17. It just felt like, I don't really enjoy this. I don't really think it's helping anybody. And then I'd read Thomas Jefferson, who said that, Thomas Jefferson said, I've never seen a man change his mind because of an argument. And Jefferson saw a lot of those. And I figured if Jefferson never saw a man or woman change their minds, I probably wouldn't either. So I thought there must be another way forward. And so I started studying, and I started realizing that, in fact, only a relatively small number of people were red or blue. And that actually the largest number were independent. And in the millennial generation, it's actually much higher. It's almost 60%. So, okay, maybe I didn't have to be red or blue. Maybe I could be something else. So I started studying mediation and conflict resolution and bridge building and, all that good stuff. And I thought, oh, now, the way in which the mind works so subtly how subtly self-righteousness can creep into almost anything. Now, having tried to be self-righteously conservative and then self-righteously liberal, now I was self-righteously a mediator and conflict resolution person who was going to make things better with my new brand of self-righteousness. And I started, with very good intentions now in my 30s and 40s, bringing communities together with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation to look at, okay, rather than funding this liberal group or funding this conservative group, what if we funded the liberal and conservative groups to work together and come to a common enterprise for their community? And then when they came together with the common enterprise, fund the common enterprise. So I persuaded the Rockefeller Foundation and other foundations to do that, and it seemed like a really good idea, and there were all these great dialogues and great projects, and it seemed to be making great progress. And then I was so successful that for some strange reason, even though there were a lot of famous people in Washington who could have gotten the job, I was hired by the United States Congress to design the retreats in the late 90s. So you may remember that there was a period when the Congress was falling apart for the first time in the 1990s, And they had the wisdom then to actually go to Hershey, Pennsylvania for retreats. And I was the one who designed and facilitated those retreats. And my employer was a congressional committee of 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans. So I had to face myself again and realize that I was terrified. I thought I was going to fail because if the conservatives liked me and were willing to work with me in my design, the liberals wouldn't. And if the liberals liked me, the conservatives wouldn't. And it was a very hard and challenging time, and it ended extremely well in the short run. Obviously not in the long run. But in the short run, it ended very well in the sense that the committee really appreciated my work. I grew to appreciate all 10 members of the committee, who were extremely different people, black, white, wealthy, unwealthy, north, south, hyper-conservative, hyper-liberal. And they all agreed that the relationship between the members of Congress was going into the gutter and needed to be resurrected. And they came up with a lot of proposals, and when they went back to Congress, the party leaders made sure that nothing that they suggested ever happened. Because if anything came out of that retreat, it would decrease the power of the party leaders, and they did not want anything to decrease their power. So even though it was an extremely successful experience, I now had to realize that, okay, I went from having yet another solution to the problem to being back in this place of being a beginner and a learner, of noticing over the years, it was like the red light went on. It's like if the red light on your car went on, it says you need oil on the dashboard, and the red light went on in 1997. If you never put oil in it for 20 years, you wouldn't be surprised if your car eventually stopped working, no matter how good the engine was. Well, that's basically what's happened to our country, in my point of view. We've never put oil in the engine, because the oil is what we're talking about here today. The oil is collaborative leadership. The oil is realizing we're all interdependent and connected. The oil is moving from confirming what we believe to learning, et cetera. So we'll get to that. So I kind of went back to the drawing board, and I tried to go back to beginner's mind, and I tried to cut back in touch with that early feeling of what does it mean to love America? What would you really do if you loved America? And I tried to just become simple and drop beneath my intellect and say, well, what's the fundamental truth in which I'm living? And the first thing I realized was that, when I came into this room, I came in like this. I don't know how you came in, but I came in walking on a left foot and a right foot. And if I lead with my left foot, I push off with my right to go anywhere. And if I'm leading with my right, I have to push off with my left. So I think, okay, well, my feet know that left and right are part of the whole. And I realized, well, my eyes, when I'm looking at you or you're looking at me, if I'm blessed with 2 eyes, I'm looking with 2 eyes and I can see better because I have a left eye and a right eye and I've got binocular vision. So, and I've got 2 ears so I can hear better. Some of us have hearing aids, some of us don't, but we're all blessed to have 2 eyes and 2 ears for a reason, and 2 feet. And when we do things, we want 2 hands. I mean, who wants to live like this or like this? We're much more capable and effective if we can work together with our left hand and right hand. And if our left hand and right hand aren't fighting, but actually collaborating to tie our shoes or to make dinner or to hold a baby or to catch a bubble. So on our bodies levels, it was pretty clear we were transpartisan beings. We were, if not enlightened, we were certainly integral beings who were capable of holding the whole and capable of collaborating with left and right when we do anything. But the problem is our minds. I said to myself, well, what about our minds? Are our minds inherently polarized? There are all these issues. Maybe it's the mind that's the problem. But then I started thinking about the mind, and I thought, well, what are the odds that on all those issues, any one of you would be consistently conservative, or any one of you would be consistently liberal? When you were born whole, with 2 feet, 2 eyes, 2 ears, what are the odds you'd be consistently red or blue? Well, the statistics show that a very small percentage of people are actually all red or all blue. Most people are a combination. But those people who are a combination, which is almost all of us, we don't have anywhere to go. We have to pretend we're red or blue. We have to pretend we're one color and that we are not actually part of a whole. So I started thinking about different issues, and I thought, when you see a pregnant woman, do you think, oh, I really care about the mom, but I don't really care about the baby? Or do you think, oh, I really care about that baby, I hope that baby has a great life, but no, who cares about the mom? No. We immediately think, what a beautiful sight. It's life coming into fruition. It's beautiful. And we think about it as a whole. Yet as soon as it gets political, it's all about a woman's right to choose or a child's right to live. And when it comes to other issues, we'll say, well, are you pro-gun or anti-gun? That's the choices we're given in this red-blue choice. But I said, when I've worked with school communities and they want their children to be safer than they were in Sandy Hook, they're not really interested in whether they're being right or left. They're interested in whether their kids are going to be safer tomorrow than they were the day before. And it's not safer for there to be a gun on the hip of every bus driver and every teacher and in every drawer and on every parent's car. That doesn't make kids safer. And it doesn't make kids safer for there to be 0 guns anywhere near the school. Because if there's 0 guns anywhere near the school, then you can have one crazy person come and do an enormous amount of damage. So you actually have to have parents who care about the safety of their kids come together and say, how do we make our school safer so our kids will be safe? And that requires a deep conversation where you find some common ground that's not right or left, but is truly technicolor in its answer. And as I started looking at more and more issues, I realized that was always my truth. When it came to the economy and it came to the question of debt, I realized that I was a profound conservative. I think debt is an outrage. I think leaving young people with a pile of debt is an outrage. I think we're mortgaging their future. On the other hand, I'm an absolute liberal when it comes to the fact that I don't think you're supposed to cut food stamps. I don't think you're supposed to not care for our fellow citizens in order to balance the budget. So I'm a classic conservative liberal when it comes to the economy, and that's true for all the issues. I won't go through all of them with you, but when I don't want the government looking at my emails or listening to my phone calls, I don't think that makes me a liberal or a conservative. I think it just makes me somebody who wants my privacy. And when I look at the politicians, they're liberals who don't want people looking at your emails, and they're conservatives who don't want people looking at your emails, because it's not about right and left. It's about what your core values are and what you believe. And it requires coming together and finding that deeper complementarity between two competing values. I think the key is it's about learning. It's about learning, and I think the Founding Fathers wanted us to learn, not just with our intellects, but with our intuition. The Founding Fathers are not going to give us the answer on sexting. The Founding Fathers are not going to tell us what to do about climate change. The Founding Fathers are not going to tell us what to do about outsourcing jobs to China or how to stop ISIS. Because the Founding Fathers lived 200 years ago, and they had no idea these issues were ever going to emerge. They thought the sun and the moon and the stars and the weather and the rain was just the weather. They didn't know they were going to have to deal with climate change. So they actually built the system so we could learn and not recite left-wing or right-wing ideologies, but to learn. And that means going back to square one. And if we're not willing to learn because we care about only our country, we can also say, let's learn because we care about the world. Because America has a role to play in the world. I think America had a gift to give the world. America inspired the world for a period of time. Not that we were ever perfect, by the way, but we did inspire other countries. A lot of people have wanted to come to this country because they felt inspired. And I think if we're going to continue to inspire, we're going to have to learn to work through our differences. Now, some of our leaders have been willing to say that they were American citizens and global citizens. For them, there was no contradiction. But other leaders have said, oh no, global citizen, that's a phrase I don't like. I don't like anything to do with global citizen. So there's just like there's a tension within our country about what it means to be an American, there's a tension in our country about how we feel about global citizenship. And it's very naive to say that we all care about the world and that we all are global citizens, because there are large numbers of Americans who say, no, I'm not a global citizen. And there's a split. So I want to spend a little time now diving a little bit slower and deeper into the structure of human consciousness, because I promised you at the beginning we were going to turn to the question of how do we harness conflict to meet Einstein's challenge. And I think it's extremely hard to meet Einstein's challenge when we're at the 1.0, and I'm using software language. I'm using software language intentionally because I don't know about you, but when Microsoft comes out with Microsoft Office 12 and I have 10, I don't think I'm 10, I'm not getting 12. I think, I wonder if 12's better. I'm open to going to 12. I'm not certain I will, but I'm curious. So the same way, I feel like there's software iterations of what it means to be a citizen. And I think the first iteration is, look out for yourself. It's a very honorable thing. It's called self-interest. Look out for yourself. Make sure you get a good job. Make sure you get an education. Make sure you have a roof over your head. Make sure you get a fair share of what you're supposed to get. An ego-based approach. If we don't do that, we don't eat. We don't survive. So it's a very honorable component of being a citizen. But then as we start to grow a little bit, we start to say, well, I'm actually not just interested in myself. I'm interested in my group. And I'll quote Mandela here. Mandela in Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela said, when I was a kid, I just liked to play in the woods. I just wanted to be happy and play in the woods with my friends. But then he said, I got a little older, and I started realizing that I cared a lot about black South Africans. I was a black South African, and I wanted black South Africans to have a better shake in our country. He started identifying with his group, and we're all glad he did. He was looking out for us, just like you now have an entire world of people who are looking out for themselves as Shiites, or looking out for themselves as Sunnis, or looking out for themselves as Serbs, or looking out for themselves as Christians, or looking out for themselves as Brits who want their country to be free from the EU, or looking out for whoever they think us is. So that's definitely a step forward. You're not just caring about yourself, you're caring about a group. And it's, again, a very honorable way of being a citizen. But then we get to this place where we say, but I'm an American, or I'm a Kenyan, or I'm a Nepali, or I'm a French person, or I'm a citizen of the UK. I'm a Canadian. Well, what does that mean? Well, what we're really saying then is I think that we're saying we're identifying with something larger than just our group. And it definitely is a step forward in consciousness, as you can see from this election this year in America. There are a lot of Americans who think they love America who are right now hating other Americans and calling them horrible names, whether it's deplorables on the one side or elitists on the other. So talking about Citizen 3.0 as if it's just another step, it's actually a pretty big step. It means that you're willing to identify with something at a higher level than your group. One could even call it that you're identifying with the soul of a nation. Now, 20 years ago, I wrote a book called A House Divided, 6 Belief Systems Struggling for America's Soul. And I remember the publisher saying to me, why did you say America's soul? And I said, because I feel that's what we're struggling about. The 6 belief systems that I described, and by the way, if none of you need to go read the book, but suffice it to say 4 of the 6 were represented this year by Clinton, Sanders, Cruz, and Trump, for your information. The other 2 were not quite as easily represented, although if you looked at the book, you'd say, oh yeah, they were there too. But these belief systems, I studied them during the 90s. I went working in conflicted communities, and wherever I went, from San Antonio to Portland to Tallahassee to Pittsburgh, you'd find basically the same belief systems struggling for control of that city or community. So I realized it was a struggle for the soul of America. And so to get to Citizen 3.0 means, yeah, I've got my differences because I'm black or white or Hispanic, or I'm rich or poor, I live in the South or the North, or I'm in the business sector or the public sector, but wherever you are, you say, I'm willing to identify as an American, and I'm willing to connect my soul to the soul of my country. So that's definitely a step ahead. But again, there are people who are totally committed to American this and American this and American this and American this, and they're pretty willing to shaft other countries. I don't know if you have noticed that, but there's a certain kind of Americanism that says, yeah, let's look out for us, but I don't really care about Japan. I don't really care about China. I don't really care about Africa. All I care about is our trade agreements and getting the best deal for us. Well, that's where 3.0 shifts to 4.0, and 4.0 says, well, but there's actually something larger. And the typical way people make that transition is they'll spend time in England, or they'll spend time in France, or their parents came from, in the case of our president, Kenya. So they identify with multiple countries. Or you've traveled a little bit, or you were in the Peace Corps, so you can identify with more than one country. So you get sort of a multiple or a multicentric perspective that says, oh, there's other countries, there are other cultures, I'm not going to be narrowly an American. I'm going to broaden myself even further and identify with these 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different cultures that I happen to love and care about. You learn a foreign language like Spanish or French, and you fall in love, or you go to Italy, and you think Italy's the greatest country, or you read Eat, Pray, Love, and you fall in love with 3 countries, But the bottom line is you spread your consciousness beyond your nation. That's 4.0. Well, Gandhi, and Martin Luther King and Mandela, they all took this journey. For Mandela, the next step after realizing he cared about black South Africans is that when he went to Citizen 3.0, he realized, wait a minute, black South Africans aren't going to be free unless white South Africans free themselves from apartheid. So he started to realize, I really care about this entire country and freeing all of us from this system of apartheid. And then he realized very soon in prison that unless countries like Britain and the United States woke up and stopped supporting apartheid, apartheid would stay there forever. So his consciousness broadened to multiple countries and wanting multiple countries to wake up from that trance of racism and apartheid. And then finally he and others have said, I came to the point where I identified with the struggle for freedom all over the world and all living things. And last but not least, the non-human world. Because we human beings can make an agreement about what's good for ourselves, and we do. We make great agreements about what's good for ourselves, and we find out that our rivers have gotten dirty, or air got dirty, that we were trampling on the creation that we were depending on. So we not only have to broaden our consciousness to include all living things, but the natural world. So it's very easy to make a chart like this, but the journey is very difficult. The journey is very difficult and very challenging. And I believe that all these levels coexist in all of us all the time. I mean, if I need to go to the bathroom, I'm going to be a citizen 1.0. Excuse me, I'm going to the bathroom. At the same time, I'm walking around America with very much of a consciousness about all living things, and I'm thinking about it. And probably you are too. So we're a dynamic confluence of all these levels of consciousness within ourselves. And I think the key to some of what we're talking about here this afternoon is being aware of that. Because for me, it creates a certain compassion. If I run into somebody who is, let's just for example, some of my friends who are, I won't say friends, some of my acquaintances who are Trump supporters. And it's not because I don't feel compassion, it's just that I'm not close to them. I'm not close to a single Trump supporter. And that's not, I hope it's not out of prejudice, I'm just not close. I don't know about you, but I've gone out of my way to make acquaintance with Trump supporters and get to know them and learn to care about them. And when I find them totally stuck at a Citizen 2.0 or Citizen 3.0 level, I can accept that. I can have compassion for that because it's in me too. It's in me too. So ultimately, I feel that being a global citizen is to be somebody who advocates for an ecology of worldviews. You realize your worldview is not the only one, that you have the wisdom and humility to hold all of these in your heart, and that you're willing to lead beyond borders that divide humankind. So that's the way I kind of decide who I'm going to support and what I care about. Do they follow those kind of principles? And then finally, I want to say something about the opening 4 comments that I made, because I promised at the beginning we would address 4 questions, and I want to deal with them briefly now. I think if we are whole and have an innate embodied sense of our own wholeness and the wholeness of creation, we're going to be better able to have a peaceful, just, and sustainable world. That if I'm aware that I'm walking with my left and my right foot, and when I watch the news and I think of elections, I'm aware that Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and Stein and Johnson and all of them are part of an ecology of views. And if I can hold all of those points of view when I pull the lever for the person I prefer, that's a different person than pulling the lever for the person I prefer and hating and despising other people and wishing they would disappear from the face of the earth, which is kind of the energy that we're hearing. It's all, the energy we're feeling now in this country is as if the left was saying, I wish the right foot didn't exist, or the right foot saying, I wish the left foot didn't exist. I'd be so much better off with just one foot. Well, several of you are laughing because it's ridiculous. We're grateful to have 2 feet and 2 legs that work. So the question I'd leave with you today is about, the first affirmation is, what is it that separates us from this innate sense of wholeness? I don't think it's about, taking some course and working really hard to elevate our consciousness and become enlightened. I think it's actually about dropping in to the deepest truth of who we are at this moment right now, which is that I am grateful to be left and right and have a center that holds it all together. And if we refuse to abandon that inner sense of empowerment and truth, then we can look at all the stuff that happens around us from that grounded place of wholeness and oneness. So I think we are whole and have an innate embodied sense of our own wholeness. And the second question was about, what do politicians do? How can they deal with this? Well, I think it's possible to hold a position and even be engaged in an adversarial position. Let's say that John, thinks, I'll make this up, that John thinks the Pacific Trade Agreement is great. He's all for it. He thinks it's going to make us a better country. And I'm against the Pacific Trade Agreement because I think it's not. I think it's going to hurt workers. It's going to hurt the people in my community. I believe we can be adversarial about that and explore that, and through learning and relationship, actually deepen in our wisdom about that and come up with a better conclusion because we have differences of opinion. I've experienced that on every level of my life. Why can't we experience it as a nation? So I believe we can hold positions and engage in adversarial advocacy while grounding ourselves in this inner sense of wholeness. If I try to turn John into an evil person who I want to dominate and control, no, that's not going to work. But if I see him as an other human being who's got a different point on the wheel and I'm engaged in a relationship, and I believe the key word in democracy is relationship. I believe on November 9th, everybody in America will wake up to the fact that it's back to being about relationship. It was always about relationship. And that winning was a temporary illusion. Third, I told you a little bit about my soul's journey from red to blue to arguing to mediating to working with Congress to that was the journey of a soul. And I believe nations also, the soul of a nation is also on a journey. And I personally believe there's a deep connection between my soul and the soul of the nation, and your soul and the soul of the nation. And I feel personally that the biggest gift of loyalty and allegiance I can give to America is to bring the fullness of my soul to this country. And the fullness of my soul means do not sell myself out to be red or blue. My soul is not red or blue. My soul is technicolor. My soul is a rainbow. My soul is all the colors of the rainbow, all the colors of the palette. And that's what my country wants from me, and I think that's what our country wants from you. So that our soul's journey is very connected to the soul of a nation, and I think the soul of humanity. And then finally, I personally believe that this Einstein's challenge is again related to the soul dimension. That I think when Einstein said you can't solve problems on the same level of awareness that created them, I think he was talking about intellect, saying you can't solve problems on the same level of intellect that created them. You have to drop into what some people would call the heart, others would call intuition, others might call wholeness. But you have to definitely either have to drop, or if you like the other metaphor, rise to a different level of awareness to solve problems. And that fundamental shift, I think, is that John is not, if he's a conservative and I'm a liberal or vice versa, he is not my enemy. He is not my enemy. He is my adversarial complement. He is my adversarial complement. And if I say, look, let's spend money to fix this and spend money to fix this, I need an adversarial complement who says, we're in debt. The money doesn't exist. We have to make choices. We have to be prudent and frugal. And if I have the attitude of, we've got a debt, we can't spend any money on those kids who are hungry or on anything, screw all those people who need, unemployment benefits, well, I need a compliment who'll say to me, wait a minute, we're a decent and compassionate nation, and we can take care of each other. So that's what I mean by an adversarial compliment and part of seeing the whole. And I think that's the challenge we face, and that's what's missing in our culture today. So I want to conclude, as I promised you, by just sharing with you a few what I would call action steps. And one action step is about your own learning. I strongly encourage you, if you're a conservative, spend some time with liberal reading and liberal websites and liberal television stations. And if you're a liberal, spend some time with conservative news sources and conservative media. Get out of your bias bubble and really experience the wholeness. In the closing chapter of my book, The United States of America, I call it, take a transpartisan vacation. Take a vacation from your political identity. It is tremendously relaxing. And just like on a vacation, you go to wherever you go, Belize or Florida or Canada, wherever you go, you come back with something back to your life from your vacation that, hey, I really like that. I'm going to do that at home, So I'd say that's something, an action, a personal action you can take. Let yourself learn and grow, and make a friend or an acquaintance who differs from you and dive in a little more deeply. Why did you start to feel that way? And how did you first come to have that opinion? And what was that experience like? And how did your parents feel when that happened? And just have that conversation to deepen yourself. So that's the first action step, is your own learning. The second is become aware of the other America that you don't know exists. The other America is the part of America that's not red and blue. It's the other America that's not about Donald Trump's hair or Hillary Clinton's emails. It's about the many organizations that I write about in my book, and that probably some of you are part of, that are crossing the red-blue divide every day. I describe 40 of those organizations in my book. There's an organization called the Bridge Alliance that actually has a membership of 45 organizations. All of them are crossing the divide all the time. Some of them crossing divides in churches, schools, state legislatures, you name it. Wherever you are in business, they're crossing the divide between red and blue. They're bringing the complements together. Get to know them. And if you feel like it, join one of them. I'm not here to advocate for any particular one. I'm just here to say there's a lot going on there and out there besides the red box and the blue box. And we deserve to be free, to free ourselves from them. And then the third action step I'd like you to consider is, I think as a nation, we deserve a better way of discussing our differences than we've been shown this year. I think with all the work that we've done around spirituality, conflict resolution, mediation, dialogue, community building, convening, there are so many methods that have developed over the last 30, 40 years. We could do better. We could have a better way of having discussions and debates about immigration, about education, about all the issues that face us, all the issues that were on that slide. We could have a much better conversation about that. I think we're capable of it, and that's what I'm going to be dedicating myself to in the next few years, is seeing if we can bring together major partners from the left, right, and center, all of whom are appalled at the level of discourse this year, and bring them together and say, let's create a way of engaging with each other that we're worthy of. So I'll conclude by quoting John, who said, "We are always looking at wholeness even when we are looking at one color." I'll repeat that. We are always looking at wholeness even when we are looking at one color. And that's a frame of mind, that's a consciousness that I used to think we had to work really hard at and maybe meditate and maybe have a spiritual teacher. And now I realize all I have to do is remember my hands, my feet, my lungs, the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere of my brain that's processing right now. All I have to do is ground myself in the truth of my being, and I will never forget who I am. And I think what our country really wants of each of us, our country wants us to remember who we truly are. Thank you. Thank you.